All right, nib holder, and great. Nib hold. Get in there, you. Uh, Somebody should make a nib holder that fits this nib. Hey everyone, this is CJ of CJ's Creative Studio, and today we are going to address this nib, the Brause 361 Steno, more commonly known as a blue pumpkin. Now here I am trying to put it into my favorite nib holder with a standard insert, and it just doesn't want to go in. Very frustrating. So here's a different nib holder, again with a standard insert, and it doesn't want to go in. What are you going to do? So here's a comics nib holder. It tends to hold larger nibs, and it holds this one, but not all the way. That's a bit of a problem. You can see if I'm in writing position, the nib is sticking out a little more than really seems sane, to be honest. So let's try a holder from Brause. You'd think that this would be the perfect thing to hold this nib, and it really is not, which I found very disappointing. I mean, it barely goes in at all. Now, the one nib holder that this fits great in is this oblique nib holder. I mean, it's fantastic. Unfortunately, I don't tend to favor oblique nib holders. So while the nib does fit, it's not something I want to write with a lot. So what are you going to do? Well, in my case, I figure I have a 3D printer. I know how to design, so why not make a custom nib holder? So I fire up Fusion 360 and set about coming up with something. First I create the components, and then I come out with parameters, which I find are a lot easier to use, especially when you're prototyping, because there are so many variables involved, where things are placed, tolerances of materials and things like that. It's a lot easier to change just one number instead of having to constantly go into the design and move things around. Now, obviously, I did experiments before I even did this. I knew this was going to work. So this isn't, ooh, I wonder if it's going to work. Yes, it's going to work. No suspense here. But when I'm designing this, I'm kind of designing something that's very, very simple. It's not the greatest design. It's a little thick. But it does the one thing that I really needed it to do. It'll fit on my printer's print bed, which, since I have a small printer, is no small thing. So after I've set up the profile of the holder and I revolve that around so I had a cylindrical type shape, next comes in the kind of working bits. First I have to put in a hole, and since I'm going to be working on an interior surface, I also put in a sort of slicing mechanism so I could see the internal parts. The next part was putting in the tongue that actually will put pressure on the nib that will hold it in the holder. And it's really nothing more than a half cylinder. And the cylinder size was originally figured by actually measuring the nib and doing some calculations, which is always fun, because nibs are kind of round, but not exactly. So the measurements you take and the calculations you do aren't exact. So you still have to print out test cylinders and things like that in order to see what actually does work. And I went through a lot of those. So I finally came up with measurements that work with the Brause 361. And if you tweak all the numbers just right, it works very well. Now this part is kind of an internal fill that I originally designed in just to make sure I didn't have this great big empty space in my holder. But it turns out that it actually acts as a nice stop on the tongue so that it doesn't get too pliant and the nib stays snugly inside the holder, which was a kind of surprising design benefit that I had not originally intended. So after I saved this design and exported it, it was onto my tiny little printer. It's a Monoprice Select Mini version 1. And the reason I have a caret is because I happen to have orange filament loaded into the machine. So there you go. And this is about as tall as I can print something. So, I mean, it would be great to have a larger printer, but not everybody has that option. So here it is. I'll print it up, and fortunately I could probably use it right away because I did put chamfers in all the openings, but just to make sure, and since this is the part that was attached to the print bed itself, I'm going to use a small utility knife and just make sure that any flashing that was still attached is removed. Like I say, this probably isn't totally required, but for my own peace of mind, I like to make sure that I give myself the best chance of success possible. And since there was only one curve and one straight line, it really wasn't a lot to do. So now comes the acid test. Does this nib fit in this holder? Previous designs worked, and this one does too. It went in easily, it stays in well, and comes out without too much effort. Exactly what you'd want in a nib holder. If you hold it regular, it feels nice and the nib is in the right position. So let's do some testing. And by testing, I mean just do a few quick squiggles to see if it actually feels okay. And doing it in the conventional position, it feels great. Unfortunately, if you're holding it in a sort of ornamental or flourishing position, this holder feels terrible. So I'm going to have to design a new one. But that is one of the joys of being a creator and being a maker and designing new things. You prototype, you find out what works, what doesn't, and then you refine later. So overall, I think the grade that we will give to this entire exercise is a good, solid yay. Honestly, I'm kind of amazed that even though I did tests before, that this worked the first time out. So if you like this video, please click the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and remember, be creative and keep on practicing. Yay!